Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon and welcome to today's event, a holistic journey for survivors of conflict-related sexual violence, co-organized by the Office of the SRSG for Sexual Violence in Conflict, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Sierra Leone, Norway, and generously hosted by the African Union. This event will have 4 segments. We will open the conversation with a high-level statement from our co-organizers and partners. We will then move to a panel discussions and hear first-hand accounts from survivors, service providers, and national judicial actors on what it takes for the journey towards justice to become a reality. We will then hear closing statements and allow for a few interventions from the floor. Our timing today is very short to address a complex topic, so as such, I kindly ask everyone to strictly stick to their speaking time. I wouldn't want to cut anyone off. And without further ado, I now turn to Mrs. Fatima Madabio, First Lady of Sierra Leone. Thank you for being with us. Sierra Leone is a country which has had to grapple firsthand with accountability for conflict-related sexual violence in the wake of its own conflict. And based on its unique experience, Sierra Leone, alongside Japan and other member states, co-sponsored in 2022 an important resolution in the General Assembly on international cooperation for access to justice, remedies, and assistance for survivors of sexual violence, thus illustrating the importance that your country attaches to the matter. Excellency, you have the floor.
Thank you. Excellencies, Your Excellency, my dear sister Denise, and the Vice President of OFLA, First Lady of the Democratic Republic of Congo, Excellencies here present, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. I bring you all greetings from His Excellency Retired Brigadier Julius Madabio, President of the Republic of Sierra Leone. On behalf of the delegation of Sierra Leone, I express sincere gratitude to the Office of the Special Representative of the Secretary General on Sexual Violence, the co-sponsoring mission, and other stakeholders for organizing today's event on a critical and timely topic aimed at examining the whole continuum of sexual violence in conflict accountability chain. I also thank our host, the Permanent Observer Mission of the African Union to the United Nations, for the kind accommodation. This subject matter resonates in a very special way to His Excellency Dr. Julius Madabio, President of the Republic of Sierra Leone, a foremost champion of gender equality and equity. It certainly resonates with me as I have dedicated my public work to tackling sexual gender-based violence around the world. Women, girls, and children have always and continue to be the most vulnerable in conflict situations. Men and boys are also victims who mostly suffers in silence. For those champions, leaders, advocates, agitators, and survivors fighting the scourge of sexual and gender-based violence, we recognize you all for the relentless hard work on this important mission. The drive, determination, and efforts to bring the required change to the lives and livelihoods of mostly women and girls globally amidst all odds are commendable. Sierra Leone have had a well-recognized reputation for tackling action to ensure accountability for sexual violence in conflict. Following the conclusion of the decade-long civil war in Sierra Leone over 20 years ago, 2 transitional justice mechanisms were established: the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the Special Court for Sierra Leone. The Special Court for Sierra Leone was among the first to grapple with some of the most important recurring legal dilemmas for most modern post-conflict situations. For example, The court was the first international criminal court to prosecute persons bearing greatest responsibility and to recognize the new crime against humanity of forced marriage as an other inhumane act. In post-conflict situation, as the legacy of conflict-related sexual violence regrettably linger, one main focus must be to ensure that the zero-tolerance policy to SGBV becomes a reality. In this regard, it is crucial to accelerate our collective action to end all forms of sexual violence globally. Violence against women and girls in this context take many different forms, including domestic violence, sexual assault and harassment, child, early and forced marriage, and sex trafficking. It is rooted in gender inequality. It is rooted in gender equality that women face throughout their lives from childhood through to old age. I cannot help but quote His Excellency President Biyote's description of the menace when he once said, "The depravity of sexual violence is obscene, criminal, and totally objectionable." He now urged the General Assembly to act in global solidarity on access to justice for survivors of sexual violence. This, he said, was building upon Sierra Leone's domestic effort against sexual and gender-based violence. In addition to the relevant UN Security Council resolution on the 22nd September 2022, the Sierra Leone and Japan-led resolution on access to justice for survival of sexual violence was adopted consensuously by the United Nations General Assembly. Sierra Leone is proud and grateful for the broad support from the 83 member states that co-sponsor the important gap-filling resolution. The resolution built on previous critical work undertaken by the United Nations General Assembly and Security Council to protect survivors in conflict situations by extending protection to survivors during peacetime. We know statistically that most sexual violence in the world happens outside of war. The mechanism or outlined in Resolution 76304 therefore reinforce the theme of ensuring accountability in the holistic justice journey. The accountability mechanism, as outlined by Resolution 76304, involve multiple stakeholders, including governments, civil society organizations, and international and regional organizations. The resolution called for victims and survivors to be urgently provided access to justice and effective remedies. These include the provision of comprehensive legal protection for victims, effective legal assistance, and protection of victims and witnesses from reprisals. The multi-sectoral support service include the establishment of comprehensive, coordinated trauma and gender responsive services, health, psychological assistance, and protection. The resolution calls for the need of child victims to be addressed, prevention, and awareness. Critically, it urges enhanced international cooperation to combat sexual violence. I trust that with this lens and many perspectives we will share today, this high-level side event will continue to spotlight the issue of addressing sexual violence in conflict areas. Thank you for your collaboration and support in strengthening protection for all survivors, and thank you for championing a cause that is so dear to my heart and that of the people of Sierra Leone. May God bless you all.
Thank you, Excellency. I think, do we have the minister with us now? Vous êtes, si vous voulez bien vous joindre à nous, monsieur. Thank you for going first. We'll now turn to His Excellency Mr. Albert Fabrice Puella, Minister of Human Rights for the Democratic Republic of Congo. Bienvenue, Monsieur le Ministre.
Merci.
La République démocratique du Congo est un partenaire de longue date de notre mandat et un des pays qui s'est engagé avec vigueur dans la lutte contre l'impunité pour les violences sexuelles, et ce, de façon holistique. La législation nationale en particulier a été mise en conformité avec les standards internationaux et tout récemment, en décembre dernier, le gouvernement a adopté une loi et créé un fonds national de la protection et des réparations pour les victimes de violences sexuelles et de crimes contre la paix et la sécurité. Les cours congolaises ont déjà rendu un certain nombre de verdicts témoignant des résultats qui peuvent être accomplis lorsque la détermination politique et les moyens sont présents. Nonobstant ces résultats, les défis pour éradiquer ce fléau restent immenses. Excellence, vous avez la parole.
Excellence, Madame la représentante spéciale du secrétaire général chargé des violences sexuelles en situation de conflit. Excellence, Monsieur les représentants du Royaume de Norvège, vous nous excuserez tomber rapidement. On ne sait pas trop, certainement on va se mêler les pinceaux avec le protocole. Mais sachez que nous sommes avec vous et Excellence, Monsieur, Excellence, Madame la représentante de la République de Sierra Leone, très distinguée Première Dame de la République démocratique du Congo, Madame Denise Nyakero, Excellence, Madame la directrice exécutive de l'UNFPA, Mesdames et Messieurs, distingués invités, tous en vos titres et qualités. Depuis près de 3 décennies, la République démocratique du Congo, notre pays, est victime de conflits armés, lui imposés pour des raisons essentiellement économiques. Et dans cette conquête, plusieurs crimes de masse, crimes de droit international sont commis, y compris les violences sexuelles délibérément utilisées par les bourreaux comme armes de guerre. La République démocratique du Congo, notre pays, est actuellement en train d'implémenter les mécanismes de justice transitionnelle ou justice réparatrice. Après 32 ans de dictature et 18 ans de graves violations des droits de l'homme et du droit international humanitaire sur toute l'étendue du pays. Ainsi, tous les piliers sont en gestation et les grandes lignes pour leur exécution déjà en marche, avec un rapport final de la politique nationale sur la justice transitionnelle avec tous les détails. Le projet de loi sur la justice transitionnelle n'attend que les conclusions des consultations nationales sur la justice transitionnelle pour être présenté au Parlement. En faisant partie de ces processus de justice transitionnelle, les viols et les violences sexuelles sont pris en compte par le ministère des Droits humains qui dirige ces processus. Dans le souci de lutter contre ces viols et violences sexuelles, surtout en période de conflit, la République démocratique du Congo a adopté et promulgué depuis 2006, vous l'avez dit, les lois numéro 06/018 et 06/19 du 20 juillet 2006 relatives à la répression des infractions de violences sexuelles et tout récemment la loi numéro 22/067 du 26 décembre 2022 portant prévention et répression de la traite des personnes, en particulier des femmes et des enfants. Il faut également faire état de la campagne de tolérance zéro lancée par son Excellence, Monsieur le Président de la République, Félix Antoine Tshisekedi Tshilombo le 20 juin 2021 sur les crimes et l'impunité de la violence basée sur le genre. Elle avait pour objet la sensibilisation du public sur toutes les formes de violence à l'égard des femmes et la vulgarisation des politiques, des stratégies et des plans y relatifs. En outre, le décret numéro 23/20 du 9 juin 2003, modifiant et complétant le décret numéro 22/38 du 6 décembre 2022, fixant le statut d'un établissement public dénommé Fonarev, spécialement dédié à la prise en charge holistique des victimes. La loi numéro 22/065 du 26 décembre 2022 fixe les principes fondamentaux relatifs à la protection et à la réparation des victimes de violences sexuelles liées au conflit et des victimes de crimes contre la paix et la sécurité de l'humanité. Cette loi prévoit les principes de la centralité des victimes, leur prise en charge holistique, les modalités de protection des victimes ainsi que la gratuité pour tous les actes de procédure. Si la justice transitionnelle se fait souvent en temps de paix dans plusieurs pays, nous sommes en train de mettre en place ce processus au moment où certaines parties du territoire national sont encore en proie à des confrontations militaires. Et donc, nous croyons que les bourreaux de viols et violences sexuelles seront identifiés et poursuivis une fois les conditions de poursuite judiciaire sont propices pour la sécurité des victimes, pour paraphraser le chef de l'État hier à la tribune des Nations Unies. Quant aux défis, nous sommes un pays non post-conflit, mais en plein conflit. Ainsi donc, la chaîne entraînant à la dénonciation des violeurs, leur arrestation, leur jugement et leur condamnation pendant le conflit est une tâche extrêmement difficile pour notre gouvernement qui doit sécuriser les déplacés internes dus à tous les conflits internes et internationaux auxquels la RDC fait face. Comment allons-nous créer un environnement propice quand la plupart des sites où tous ces crimes de masse se déroulent ne sont pas sous contrôle gouvernemental? Pour ces premiers objectifs à atteindre, nous sommes disposés à travailler comme nous le faisons déjà avec l'écosystème de la société civile, mais aussi d'autres partenaires. Toutefois, dans un environnement de conflits armés, nous croyons que vos expériences et les expériences d'autres pays, comme la Colombie que nous avons visitée il y a peu, ayant vécu des situations similaires que les nôtres, nous seront vraiment utiles. Ensuite, nous croyons que les Nations Unies vont comprendre que les efforts pour pacifier les pays doivent être aussi parmi leurs priorités, votre priorité. Et surtout que les causes profondes de ces conflits et les potentiels commanditaires de M23 et les autres rébellions sont clairement connus. Pourquoi pas nous aider à matérialiser notre souhait et celui des rédacteurs du rapport mapping afin que la RDC puisse avoir sur son sol un tribunal pénal international ou même dans le cadre de la justice transitionnelle, un tribunal spécial pour la paix comme pour la paix à la colombienne. Un autre défi pour lequel nous faisons un plaidoyer est celui qui concerne le renforcement des capacités auprès de tous les acteurs qui doivent œuvrer dans la chaîne de prise en charge judiciaire des victimes en République démocratique du Congo. Les personnels, les OPJ, de l'OPJ aux magistrats, du parquet comme du siège, mais aussi des représentants des associations de victimes ou des représentants des associations d'aide aux victimes, n'est pas suffisamment outillé ou équipé pour travailler dans ces domaines combien sensibles et délicats afin d'éviter une double stigmatisation ou remuer des plaies encore béantes auprès de toutes ces victimes. Le ministère des Droits humains a un faible budget de tous les ministères du gouvernement, mais vous comprendrez avec nous que les défis auxquels ces ministères transversaux pourtant font face sont largement au-delà de nos moyens. Raison pour laquelle, étant donné que les crimes pour lesquels nous nous entretenons cet après-midi sont des crimes internationaux parce qu'ayant choqué la conscience congolaise et internationale. Nous plaidons pour une grande levée de fonds au niveau international. Heureusement que nous avons votre soutien, Madame Paten. Nous avons le chef de l'État qui est le champion de la masculinité positive et à côté de qui il y a une grande héroïne qui fait de la lutte contre la violence basée sur le genre son cheval de bataille. J'ai parlé de la First Lady Madame Denise Nyakero dont nous saluons la présence. Nous plaidons, disais-je, pour une grande levée de fonds au niveau international pour que nous fassions face à tous les différents challenges et réussir à mettre les victimes de violences sexuelles de la République démocratique du Congo en confiance pour qu'elles ne gardent plus silence parce que ne trouvant pas en face un personnel digne de confiance, un État suffisamment capable sur tous les plans de prendre en charge tous les volets pour une prise en charge holistique de celle-ci. Nous vous remercions.
Je vous remercie, Excellence. And to conclude our high-level segment, I now turn to Under-Secretary General Pramila Patten, Special Representative of the Secretary General for Sexual Violence in Conflict, who has, throughout her tenure, put holistic and victim-centric justice at the heart of her mandate. SRSG, you have the floor.
Thank you. Your Excellency, Mr. Albert Fabrice Puela, Minister of Human Rights for the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Your Excellency, Madame Biyo, First Lady of the Republic of Sierra Leone, Your Excellency, Madame Denise Nyakero Tshisekedi, First Lady of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Mrs. Anniken Huitfeldt, Minister of Foreign Affairs of Norway. Thank you for your presence here today and for your words of solidarity and support for survivors. Excellencies, distinguished guests, conflict-related sexual violence is not a cultural phenomenon, not an inevitable consequence of war, and not a lesser crime. While states bear the legal responsibility to end impunity and to prosecute all those responsible for crimes of conflict-related sexual violence, to date we have seen very few perpetrators ever brought to justice. Impunity thus remains the global norm and accountability the rare exception. While the consistent, rigorous prosecution of these crimes can translate into prevention and deterrence, lack of political will to enforce applicable law sends the opposite signal, emboldening perpetrators and demoralizing survivors by implying that it is futile and even dangerous to report. And we know that sexual violence offenses have the highest rates of impunity and recidivism. Yet the normative framework is clear and categorical, and the institutional architecture well established. The United Nations Security Council has affirmed the importance of delivering a survivor-centered approach that respects the rights and prioritizes the needs of survivors, ensuring they receive the requisite care without adverse discrimination. Measures must be taken to mitigate the risk of stigmatization and to support their socioeconomic reintegration. Security Council Resolution 2467 of 2009 calls for stronger, more comprehensive legislation, for investigation to be enhanced, including through specialized police units and courts, for the provision of legal aid, and the prompt investigation, prosecution, and punishment of perpetrators in a manner consistent with fair trial guarantees, and the provision of reparations to victims. All of these measures must be in place to create an enabling environment in which survivors can come forward to report and seek justice. The challenge before us is to translate commitments on paper into compliance in practice, to bridge our highest legal obligations and policy aspirations with operations on the ground. To do so, we are compelled to ask the question, what does a survivor-centered approach to justice mean? For the 7-year-old girl who was raped during the conflict in Sudan and forced to flee South Sudan with her grandmother, where they now live as refugees, but lack the financial means to pursue the case despite their thirst for justice. For a political activist in Myanmar who protested the coup in her country and was targeted for sexual violence as a form of reprisal to silence her dissent. Or the girl who was gang raped by armed men in Tripoli, whose family refused to file a complaint due to fears of retaliation and social norms related to honor. A young woman who became pregnant and HIV positive after being raped by 27 soldiers in northern Ethiopia, where troops are still present and a credible transitional justice process is lacking. And lastly, the Bosnian woman who was raped in 1995 and is still seeking judicial redress over a quarter of a century since the guns fell silent. These are just a few of the incidents that my office has chronicled in its reports to the Security Council and strives to address in its daily work. These crimes are unspeakable, but we are compelled to speak about them. Almost 15 years ago, the United Nations Security Council established my mandate to provide coherent and strategic leadership on this issue. As chair of the Interagency Coordination Network, UN Action Against Sexual Violence in Conflict, and through a dedicated team of experts on the rule of law and sexual violence in conflict. The intervening years have shown us that through effective partnerships with national authorities, civil society organizations, grassroots practitioners, service providers, and survivors themselves, backed by the requisite level of political resolve and financial resources, it is possible to deliver justice, protection, and assistance to help rebuild lives and livelihoods in the wake of these crimes. Yet sexual violence persists as a cheap and effective tactic of war, terror, torture, and political repression that attacks the physical integrity and agency of survivors. The goal must therefore be to restore agency to survivors and empower them at every step, from accessing services to reporting and testifying in the courtroom to applying for reparations as we walk side by side with them on the path to justice. A safe and supportive environment is foundational to enabling survivors to come forward and report these historically hidden crimes. This entails meeting the basic needs of survivors and their dependents, such as safe shelter, food security, medical care, sexual and reproductive health care, trauma counseling, and psychosocial support, as well as livelihood and socioeconomic reintegration assistance in the face of social stigma, family and community rejection, and often profound personal shame. When these essential needs are met, we see many more survivors who are ready and willing to participate in criminal justice processes. Equally foundational is a comprehensive legislative framework, including protective rules of procedure and evidence that provide safeguards for victims and witnesses, backed by specialized capacity and expertise among investigators, prosecutors, and judges. And to this end, my office has developed model legislative provisions to assist states to harmonize domestic laws with international standards, and has signed a dozen of frameworks agreements with affected states to ensure that policies of zero tolerance do not carry zero consequences. We know that not every case of sexual violence will reach a courtroom. Thus, reparations are vital, including compensation, rehabilitation, restitution, truth-telling, and guarantees of non-repetition. These rights and reparatory measures must extend to children born of sexual violence, who have often been invisible in peace-building and transitional justice processes. Ladies and gentlemen, we have here today a range of practitioners representing all links in the justice chain, from safe and ethical documentation at point of service delivery, including the collection of medical and forensic evidence, to investigation, law enforcement, prosecution, corrections, compensation, remedies, and reintegration support. The justice chain is only as strong as its weakest link. It functions as a system, or not at all. We must therefore mobilize concerted, multi-stakeholder action to replace impunity with unity. We must break the chains of silence and denial that have sentenced survivors to lifelong trauma, fear, and ostracism while the perpetrators walk free. Unless our rhetoric is matched with resources, we risk merely paying lip service to this urgent issue. Every year that I have served as special representative, the number of member states who have requested our assistance has increased, and the geographical scope of the mandate has expanded. And yet, the level of human and financial resources allocated to this agenda has not kept pace. Since my team of experts on the rule of law has been operational, it has been compelled to rely solely on voluntary contributions despite having a Security Council mandate and receiving increasing requests for ever more sophisticated technical support. It is only through adequate and sustained resources that we can do justice to this cause and, above all, its survivors. As the panelists will tell you today, where there is political will, holistic service provision, and credible, capable institutions, meaningful change is possible. Impunity for conflict-related sexual violence threatens both individual rights and international peace and security. Those who tear the fabric of society through these egregious crimes must be relentlessly pursued and effectively prosecuted. Ladies and gentlemen, in the name of the survivors, we must deliver justice, not just law, which means countering harmful norms, attitudes, and behaviors in communities, as well as courtrooms. In the name of future generations, we must make accountability the rule rather than the rare exception. By reinforcing each link in the justice chain and fostering energy of action, we can, we must, and we will convert the age-old culture of impunity into a culture of prevention and deterrence. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam SRSG. I now close the high-level segment of our event and invite our distinguished guests to rejoin their seats, and I invite the three first panelists to join me at the head table. Jeanette, Tara, and General Motumbo. In this segment, we will hear first-hand account from a number of actors of the chain of accountability, in particular for national prosecution on conflict-related sexual violence. And we will start these accounts by a short video from a survivor in Central African Republic.
Je suis centrafricaine, survivant du viol sexuel lié au temps des conflits armés avec un enfant né du viol. Coordonnatrice nationale du mouvement des suivantes en Centrafrique, Mosuka. Tout a commencé en 2003, au temps des Bayamulenge, quand on fuyait la guerre avec ma maman pour aller dans la colline. Et du coup, nous sommes tombés dans l'embuscade des Bayamulenge. Et les Bayamulenge étaient en tenue, ils ont violé ma mère devant moi et ils voulaient encore me violer. Ma mère a refusé et du coup, on a égorgé ma mère devant moi. J'ai perdu ma virginité à l'âge de 13 ans. On était partis. Mon oncle maternel a reçu les informations. Il est allé me chercher pour me ramener à la maison chez lui. Malheureusement, comme il a construit des auberges, sa femme m'utilisait comme esclave sexuelle parce que c'est moi qui utilisais tous les hommes qui venaient pour qu'ils puissent avoir de l'argent. Je suis tombée enceinte 2 fois. Elle m'a fait avorter 2 fois, c'était vraiment douloureux. Et la 3e grossesse, je suis obligée de quitter la maison. Et il y avait une maman qui était derrière la maison dont la maman m'avait pris en charge. On a quitté la maison là, on était parti louer une maison ailleurs. Et la maman là m'utilisait aussi pour vendre ses chicoins. Donc je n'avais pas les moyens pour aller à l'hôpital. Je n'ai jamais mis pied avec la grossesse à l'hôpital jusqu'à accoucher à la maison. Je n'aimais pas cet enfant. Mais c'était la maman qui s'occupait de l'enfant juste pour que je puisse vendre ses chicoins. Et en 2013, je me souviens encore, j'ai été violée par les hommes armés. Ils étaient 3. Et là, c'était horrible pour moi parce que j'avais les fistules. Mon organe génital était complètement détruit. Je ne pouvais pas aller à l'hôpital parce que je n'avais pas de l'argent. J'ai saigné pendant 1 mois. Et du coup, j'ai fait un traumatisme parce que je faisais la dépression. On m'a amené à l'hôpital. Il n'y avait personne. D'abord, j'ai été rejetée dans la famille. Arrivée à l'hôpital, à la psychiatrie, j'ai été attachée dans une chaîne parce que j'étais agressive. Et du coup, j'ai passé 2 mois à l'hôpital psychiatrie. Et quand je suis sortie, c'était difficile pour moi. Parce que ici, pour aller à l'hôpital, il faut avoir de l'argent. Déjà, une survivante du viol a besoin des soins médicaux, psychologiques et gynécologiques. Et voir un gynécologue ici en République centrafricaine, c'est très très difficile. Il faut avoir de l'argent pour payer la consultation. Et quand tu payes la consultation, il faut s'attendre à des ordonnances, à des examens médicaux. Il faut avoir de l'argent pour payer les examens médicaux qui coûtent déjà aussi cher. Il faut avoir de l'argent pour payer les examens aussi. Les examens et les ordonnances qu'on va te donner. Et c'est très très difficile. Et quand je commençais à militer dans le mouvement Mosuka, grâce au concours des partenaires, à la fondation du docteur Denis Mukwege, que j'ai fait le témoignage, et quand j'ai brisé le silence, ils m'ont amené à l'hôpital pour faire une intervention chirurgicale pour réparer mon appareil génital. Et du coup, à travers ça, le médecin m'a expliqué que je ne pourrais plus faire encore un enfant. Et là, présentement, je vis avec les séquelles. D'abord, aller aussi à la justice. Aujourd'hui, nous vivons avec les bourreaux. Et c'est très difficile d'aller à l'hôpital. C'est très difficile d'aller à la justice. Quand tu vas à la justice, il faudrait un avocat. Et un avocat, il faut payer le droit de cet avocat-là pour qu'il puisse te défendre. Et quand tu n'as pas de l'argent, d'abord les dossiers, c'est difficile pour suivre les dossiers. Et c'est très long. D'abord, tu peux payer l'ouverture des dossiers, c'est 50 000. Mais il faut attendre les restes qui restent, le reste, parce qu'il faut payer les dossiers. Et quand souvent les dossiers disent que les dossiers, c'est disparu. Et il faut avoir de l'argent encore pour faire sortir le dossier. C'est difficile pour avoir de l'argent, pour payer les dossiers, payer les avocats. Les bourreaux sont encore au pouvoir. Et tu ne peux même pas te permettre pour aller déposer une plainte au nom de ton bourreau. Parce que tu ne sais pas qui est déjà dans le gouvernement. Tu peux avoir la visite aussi d'ici demain chez toi à la maison. Les procédures de la justice sont très très longues, à tel point que souvent il y a découragement. Parce que quand tu vas, il faut payer le transport. Et tu peux prendre même 2 mois. D'abord, à la justice, là-bas au tribunal, on te dit que le dossier est ouvert. mais de jamais fermer parce qu'ils ne retrouvent plus les bourreaux. Et c'est très très difficile. Quand on ne retrouve pas les bourreaux, souvent il faut passer du temps, passer 1 an, 2 ans pour qu'on puisse te dire que le dossier est en cours. Mais malheureusement, quand tu n'as pas d'argent, tu ne peux pas avoir la justice. D'abord, aller à la justice, il faut témoigner. Et quand tu témoignes, les bourreaux sont là pour écouter. Donc c'est très très difficile. On a besoin de l'autonomisation pour survivre avec.
I thank all the colleagues who made this testimony possible from the field. I now turn to Madame Ginette Bedoya, a survivor, journalist, and activist for justice from Colombia. Ginette, gracias por su presencia hoy con nosotros y por compartir su camino personal hacia la justicia. Tiene usted la palabra.
Thank you. I'm going to speak in Spanish. Gracias a la oficina de la representante especial del secretario general sobre violencia sexual en los conflictos y especialmente a la señora Pramila Patten, que nos ha llenado de motivación a tantos sobrevivientes. ¿Qué es justicia? ¿Cómo se puede reparar lo que es imposible reparar? Porque el dolor y la impunidad son más fuertes que esa misma palabra. Soy una sobreviviente de secuestro, de tortura y de violencia sexual. Y llevo 23 años haciéndome esas dos preguntas. ¿Qué es justicia? ¿Y cómo se puede reparar lo que es irreparable? He recibido muchos abrazos y palmadas en la espalda de solidaridad de gobernantes de mi país, seguro con buena intención. Pero es que la vida de las víctimas no puede seguir adelante solo con buenas intenciones. Cada víctima tiene una idea particular e íntima de lo que significa justicia y por eso puede ser diferente en todos los contextos. Desde la cárcel para los perpetradores, el perdón público y el reconocimiento de los crímenes, atravesando por la verdad hasta la reparación material. Lo que sí es único y tiene el mismo impacto en Sierra Leona, en Colombia, en Siria, en Ucrania, en Irán, en México o en el Congo, es la impunidad. Lograr romper la impunidad es volver una y otra vez al momento de la violación o del destierro. Es transitar por el dolor interminablemente.
Just excuse me for interrupting, but just to say for everyone that the translation for Spanish is on the Arabic channel, as I understand, for those who cannot follow your statement. Please continue.
Okay. ¿Quieres que vuelva a retirarlo? ¿Está bien? Okay. Lograr romper la impunidad es volver al momento una y otra vez de la violación y del destierro. Es transitar por el dolor interminablemente. Es como una pesadilla que no tiene fecha de expiración. Esa es la mejor forma de resumir lo que significa buscar justicia. Cuando yo inicié este camino de la justicia, tenía muchas expectativas y pocos aliados, porque el primer tropiezo que encontramos los sobrevivientes es la apatía de quienes pueden cambiar nuestra realidad. Y no me refiero a la apatía emocional, me refiero al sentimiento de rechazo que despierta un hecho violento. Estoy hablando de la apatía a la acción, a meterse la mano al bolsillo para destinar recursos que permitan tener programas de apoyo en salud mental, que se traduzca en consultorios jurídicos para litigar los casos, que hablemos de medidas efectivas y no revictimizantes de protección, que haya fondos reales y eficaces de reparación individual y colectiva. Yo he pasado por todo eso. Luego de mi secuestro, no tuve apoyo psicológico, ni un médico, mucho menos un abogado. Tampoco el compromiso del sistema de justicia en Colombia. Por el contrario, los mismos fiscales se encargaron de poner todo el peso de la responsabilidad sobre mis hombros y no en los de mis victimarios. Me hicieron creer que yo tenía la culpa de haber sido violada masivamente. Me dijeron que yo era la responsable de la violación por hombres de grupos paramilitares y de la policía. La justicia en Colombia no me respondió. Aún hoy sigue sin responderme. En Colombia, mi caso está en la impunidad. Por eso toqué muchas puertas a nivel internacional y logré llevar mi caso ante la Corte Interamericana de Derechos Humanos, pero me costó la vida misma. Eso es lo que puede pasar. Eso es lo que los gobernantes del mundo no pueden seguir permitiendo que pase. No es suficiente con los discursos políticos que mencionen una y otra vez a las víctimas y a los sobrevivientes como el centro de los acuerdos de paz o de la transformación de una nación en guerra, si estos gobernantes no tienen la grandeza histórica de destinar recursos para hacer los cambios. Los estados deben entender que la afectación para un sobreviviente de violencia sexual no es solo para él o para ella, es para todo su entorno y por ende para la sociedad. No podemos seguir viendo a los sobrevivientes como casos obligados de una confrontación armada. La vergüenza, el miedo, las amenazas y la intimidación muchas veces nos superan, impidiéndonos que podamos denunciar o buscar ayuda. Por eso necesitamos compromisos sólidos. El próximo 18 de octubre se cumplen 2 años de la sentencia que la Corte Interamericana emitió contra el Estado colombiano en mi caso. Logré medidas de reparación históricas para las mujeres de mi país, como la creación de un centro de memoria para las víctimas de violencia sexual. Pero el gobierno hoy sigue sin cumplir esas medidas. Y yo no quiero esperar a que lo hagan, porque ya gasté 2 décadas ante un tribunal para comprobar que lo que denuncié era cierto, que sí me ocurrió. No puedo esperar 2 décadas más para comprobar que los sobrevivientes estamos en el centro de todo, solo en el papel. Los sobrevivientes somos parte de la acción y del cambio. El estar sentada aquí es una muestra de ello. Mis victimarios me quitaron casi todo, menos algo poderoso: mi voz. Esa voz es el eco de mi justicia, de la justicia de todas las víctimas. Gracias.
Muchas gracias, Jeanette. So both testimony we just heard illustrate clearly that the pursuit of justice is a challenging path for survivors to follow. As we heard, that journey often starts by accessing urgent services, in particular medical and psychological care, but also economic and livelihood support. However, often these services are not readily available, which has a chilling effect on victims coming forward and reporting cases. Tara Noel, you are the representative of Médecins Sans Frontières to the United Nations. MSF is one of the humanitarian actors often on the front line with survivors. Could you share with us some perspective about what is needed and the challenges faced by survivors towards accountability?
Thank you, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. MSF witnesses the impact and the scale of sexual and gender-based violence on a daily basis in all the contexts we work around the world. In 2022 alone, MSF provided medical care for 40,000 survivors of sexual violence. And sadly, in 2023, the situation seems worse, as by the end of August, we had already surpassed last year's total case numbers. We witness the crushing consequences of sexual violence of our survivors on a daily basis. We treat their physical and psychological suffering, and we hear all their heart-wrenching stories. So today, my remarks reflect the personal experiences of our patients in hopes that our perspective, as well as theirs, will support a more holistic understanding of justice. And to that effect, there's a lot can be said. But as a starting point, I want to emphasize that the treatment of sexual violence is a medical emergency, and it needs to be recognized as such. Only once we acknowledge this fact are we actually on the road to an effective, survivor-centered approach to justice. Unfortunately, MSF sees that timely access to comprehensive quality medical care and psychosocial support is often very limited or completely unavailable. And even in places where medical services do exist, many barriers prevent survivors from accessing them, whether it be insecurity, a lack of transport to facilities, a lack of knowledge of why and how to seek care, untrained medical staff, or incomplete care packages, to name only a few. So as a result, survivors tend to present to our medical facilities months after the violence has occurred, making accountability processes even harder. Treating sexual violence as a medical emergency means reducing barriers, expanding access to treatment and services. But this failure to recognize sexual violence as a medical emergency first and foremost, and seeing it primarily through a judicial or procedural prism, can have severe consequences on survivors. Systems often ask survivors to go through complicated and obstructive procedures, including having to recount their story multiple times and be examined and re-examined by various medical professionals, which can be re-traumatizing and have a significant impact on their well-being and healing process. The general lack of understanding amongst law enforcement and judicial authorities that sexual violence is a medical emergency is demonstrated when we see that sometimes survivors are accompanied or referred to police by police to medical facilities to obtain certificates, not to obtain medical care. And in several contexts, the law requires mandatory reporting and the need to establish a police case prior to receiving medical treatment. Judicial authorities often require medical documentation when pursuing a claim against a perpetrator. However, survivors can face numerous obstacles when trying to obtain those documents. In many cases, examinations, tests, and medical certificates are not free of charge, making it prohibitive for many. The documents are often only available from a small number or a pre-approved number of clinics, and at times the survivor may be re-examined by a specific doctor and needs to return multiple times to collect their certificate. The process even requires survivors to provide confidential medical information that may not even be relevant, and in some cases, unnecessary tests that are not in the interest of the survivor are performed. Systems commonly disregard the survivor's basic rights, such as respectful and dignified treatment, informed consent, privacy, confidentiality, and non-discrimination. These kinds of experiences, as told by our patients, result in a lack of trust in police, legal, and justice systems in many places where we work. And the result is that survivors, they give up. This can partially explain why we see an enormous gap between the cases that are reported and treated and those that are actually litigated. I would like to stretch our understanding of justice beyond its legal limits. What does justice look like for the survivors when the legal means to achieve it are out of reach for most? Our patients seldom focus on punitive justice and instead look for a model of justice that seeks to repair in some way the harm that's been done to them, a model that is centered on their immediate and long-term physical, psychological, and social needs. There is no justice without such a holistic approach. We also want to see justice recognize that sexual violence is a medical emergency and needs to focus on protection and healing. I would also quickly like to stretch the definition of justice a little bit by starting with prevention. And in that regard, we as humanitarians must also be part of the solution in the accountability chain. A lack of access to basic services and adequate humanitarian assistance in many contexts continues to drive women's vulnerabilities and exposure to sexual violence. Women should not be put in a situation where they risk being raped to take a shower or use a latrine because we as humanitarians have not provided adequate wash infrastructure or lighting in a displacement camp. And women should not have to risk being raped every time they leave the camp in search of food for their malnourished child. That is not a just choice. Humanitarians and governments alike need to do much better to reduce vulnerability as a first step in this justice model. Madam Moderator, I'll quickly summarize. I can recognize the need to move forward. I want to conclude by saying medical care must be a priority and should not be contingent upon anything else. Survivors should have adequate access to medical care anytime, anywhere, and without going through police and legal channels. And finally, states must do better in adopting more survivor-centered approaches through increased provision of medical services, safe referral pathways, improving awareness and training within the formal justice system. States need to address mandatory reporting and the challenges survivors face in obtaining medical certificates. And honestly, this is low-hanging fruit. And it is not the only as a humanitarian thing to do, but this holistic approach will help create more faith in the accountability processes, will help states achieve their objectives, and move us all closer in our quest for real justice for survivors. Thank you.
Thank you, Tara. I now turn to General Mutambo, who is the President of the Military High Court of the DRC. Général, sous votre impulsion, la justice militaire en RDC a pris à bras le corps la lutte contre l'impunité pour les violences sexuelles. Des poursuites ont été engagées contre les auteurs, des chefs d'accusation ont été posés et des verdicts prononcés. Pouvez-vous nous parler de ces avancées accomplies et des défis auxquels vous avez fait face?
Merci, Madame. Excellences, Mesdames et Messieurs, je remercie les organisateurs pour avoir songé à m'appeler en ce lieu pour parler de l'expérience de la justice militaire congolaise dans la lutte contre les violences sexuelles. Depuis plus de 2 décennies, la République démocratique du Congo est ravagée par des cycles de violences inédits. Un nombre impressionnant de crimes internationaux a été commis, faisant de centaines de milliers de victimes. Ces violences se sont accompagnées d'un usage systématique de viols et des agressions sexuelles par toutes les forces combattantes. Ayant pris conscience de l'ampleur et de la gravité de cette criminalité, et conformément à la politique de tolérance zéro prônée par le gouvernement de mon pays, la justice militaire, dont les ressources sont limitées pour poursuivre efficacement tous les responsables des atrocités perpétrées, a élaboré une stratégie de poursuite avec l'appui de ses partenaires. Cette stratégie identifie des critères clairs et transparents pour sélectionner et prioriser les crimes à poursuivre. C'est notamment la nature des crimes, la position des auteurs dans la chaîne de commandement, le nombre de victimes, l'accessibilité des lieux de commission des crimes, l'impact des poursuites au sein de la société, etc. Sur base des renseignements apportés par les magistrats militaires concernés par les différents dossiers, une commission mixte composée des délégués de la Haute Cour, de l'Auditorat général et des partenaires établit la liste de dossiers prioritaires à examiner pendant une période donnée. En appliquant cette stratégie, la Haute Cour et les différentes juridictions militaires inférieures, y compris les parquets leur attachés, ont priorisé les dossiers de violences sexuelles liés au conflit, ouverts à charge notamment des officiers généraux ou supérieurs et des seigneurs de guerre, chefs de groupes armés. Entre-temps, des séminaires de formation spécifiques ont été organisés avec l'appui des partenaires pour permettre aux magistrats de mieux assurer les poursuites des crimes graves et des crimes de violence sexuelle liés au conflit. Plusieurs dossiers emblématiques ou prioritaires ont été ainsi jugés à la suite de la politique de priorisation. À titre illustratif, on peut citer l'affaire Kakwavu-Bukande Jérôme. C'est un officier général qui œuvrait au sein de forces armées et qui, pendant la période de 2003 et 2004, était chef d'un groupe armé dénommé Forces armées du peuple congolais, évoluant en Ituri. Durant cette période, lui et les siens s'étaient livrés à de nombreux abus et atrocités sur la population civile, de meurtres, de tortures et de viols. En date du 23 avril 2010, celui-ci a été arrêté, Kakwavu le général, et renvoyé après instruction devant la Haute Cour militaire le 19 novembre 2010. Il sera reconnu coupable et condamné le 7 novembre 2014 à 10 ans de servitude pénale principale pour crime de guerre par viol. Une autre affaire emblématique, celui d'un certain Bedi Mobuli, alias 106. Ce monsieur, c'était un déserteur de l'armée régulière, devenu par la suite chef d'un groupe armé opérant dans le parc national Kaouzi-Biega en province du Sud Kivu. Il avait été jugé en appel et condamné par la Haute Cour militaire le 26 juillet 2018 à 20 ans de servitude pénale principale pour notamment crime contre l'humanité par viol et crime contre l'humanité par esclavage sexuel. Une autre affaire encore, celui d'un certain Maro Ntoumoua, alias Marocain, qui en fait était l'adjoint de Bedi Mobuli et qui s'était séparé de son chef et il avait formé son propre groupe armé, prétendant défendre les intérêts de la population et autochtone, privés de leur terre plutôt, par l'instauration du parc national de Kaouzi-Biega. Et ce groupe armé s'était illustré par de nombreuses exactions, dont des viols et autres agressions commises sur les populations civiles des localités riveraines du parc. Il a été jugé le 28 avril 2018 par la Cour militaire du Sud Kivu et condamné à 20 ans pour crime contre l'humanité par esclavage sexuel. Cette décision a été confirmée en appel par la Haute Cour militaire le 26 juillet 2018. Il y a une autre affaire qui concernait un député provincial du Sud Kivu qui a été jugé en appel et condamné par la Haute Cour militaire à Bukavu le 26 juillet 2018 à la peine de perpétuité. Ce député provincial du nom de Batumike Rugimbania Frédéric était à la tête d'un mouvement insurrectionnel armé ayant commis de graves violations de droits de l'homme, dont des violences sexuelles sur mineurs. Sa qualité de député n'avait pas été un obstacle aux poursuites judiciaires engagées contre lui, conformément aux dispositions du statut de Rome. Une autre affaire, c'est celle de Tcheka, qui est une affaire emblématique. Ce monsieur, c'était un ancien exploitant artisanal qui avait aussi un groupe armé appelé Ndouma Défense of Congo. Il a été jugé après un procès qui a duré 2 ans pour crimes de guerre par viol et crimes de guerre par esclavage sexuel. Cela signifie que des progrès ont été réalisés par la justice militaire, mais il y a aussi des défis, notamment l'insuffisance de moyens humains, financiers, matériels et techniques, dans la mesure où le Congo est un pays continent, mais qui ne dispose pas de beaucoup de magistrats. Il y a aussi l'inaccessibilité de certaines zones du territoire national où il y a le règne de groupes armés, la réticence des victimes de violences sexuelles. Tout à l'heure, on a dit que certaines victimes ont peur de la stigmatisation et de représailles. Il y a aussi l'insécurité, comme je l'ai dit, qui fait que les magistrats ne peuvent pas aller tenir des audiences n'importe où. Outre ces difficultés, il faut quand même reconnaître que la justice militaire, grâce à cette politique de priorisation des dossiers, a tiré des leçons suivantes. La nécessité de rapprocher la justice des justiciables à travers les audiences, l'importance d'une coordination des appuis, la nécessité d'assurer la protection de victimes, la formation continue des magistrats. Voilà ce que je peux dire par rapport à l'expérience congolaise. Je vous remercie.
Je vous remercie, Général, de cette intervention édifiante. Thank you to our first 3 panelists for sharing their experience. I now invite the second panel to take place, and if you can join your seats again. We are running late, so I would ask everyone to really keep it to short interventions. All right, thank you. I will immediately turn to Miroslava Krasnoborova, who is a Ukrainian prosecutor currently representing the Office of the Prosecutor General of Ukraine in Eurojust and working on effective investigation and prosecution of international crime, including sexual violence. Miroslava, you have the floor.
Thank you, dear Excellencies, esteemed audience. I'm really grateful to be here and this opportunity to address the issue of conflict-related sexual violence and to discuss the means of ensuring accountability for these crimes and support for the survivors. Russia invaded Ukraine 9 years ago, in 2014. And since that time, there have been consistent reports of conflict-related sexual violence in territories temporarily occupied by Russia. However, following full-scale invasion last year, we have observed an alarming escalation in such violence perpetrated by an invading forces. Since February last year, prosecutors have recorded 231 CRSV cases. It's men 82, women 149. 13 of them are minors. And we are aware that this is only a tip of iceberg. The patterns we observe are not random. They bear testament to a deliberate strategy employed by Russia with the intent to destroy the Ukrainian state and people. Sexual violence committed by Russian military often targets people based on their national identity or pro-Ukrainian views, especially against mothers, wives, and sisters of the members of Ukrainian armed forces. We also have testimonies that it is not only tolerated, but encouraged by the commanders. Furthermore, there is a mounting reporting of torture involving rape and other forms of sexual violence against Ukrainian prisoners of war and civilian detainees. Only in one detention, in one facility, we have reports over 160 individuals endured such torture, with no fewer than 17 men experiencing sexual violence, predominantly torture of the genitals with electric shocks. Conflict-related violence is one of the most underreported crimes, and survivors fear shame and stigma, as well as possible revenge from the perpetrators. First and foremost, we are working to develop institutions and mechanisms, and just recently we established a special unit that allows survivors to feel as comfortable and as possible in breaking the silence and reporting those crimes. This includes providing the necessary legal, psychological, and social support to engage the survivors in the pathway towards justice. Parallel, we are steadfast in our commitment to a holistic, survivor-centered and trauma-sensitive approach to investigating and prosecuting cases. It's vital to equip our law enforcement officers, prosecutors, judges, and medical professionals with specialized training, ensuring a compassionate and empathetic response at every step of the process. Further, we must assess all essential components of the path to justice and the way they impact survivors and witnesses. This includes collecting evidences, prosecuting perpetrators with the appropriate charges, and ensuring meaningful reparations for survivors. Justice is incomplete until every survivor has a clear path to healing and redress. And to concretize our commitments, in June, the Prosecutor General approved a strategic plan for the realization of prosecutorial functions regarding the CRSV crimes. It includes tailoring our approach to resonate with the unique identities and nuances of each survivor, ensuring the paramount safety of survivors, fostering an inclusive environment devoid of discrimination, empowering survivors with autonomy over their personal data, and countering and preventing any form of stigmatization. Sharing best practices is essential in improving our collective response to conflict-related sexual violence, and we have established cooperation in both international and domestic partners in this area. In this regard, on behalf of Prosecutor General, I would like to express our gratitude and boundless respect to our strategic partners, Madame Pramila Patten, UN Secretary General, and her office, because for their unwavering support. We particularly value their strategic advice and trainings organized for Ukrainian prosecutors and investigators, and we hope to continue and expand our fruitful partnership. It is also pivotal to mobilize Ukrainian civil society and the CRSV survivors. The Prosecutor General's office has taken the initiative to establish a collaborative working group, and it now comprises over 20 NGOs dedicated to ensuring comprehensive support for survivors, as well as jointly developing the working guidelines and necessary amendments to legislation and regulations. We welcome participation in this group from both national and global stakeholders. And though much has been done to enhance the capacity of Ukrainian justice system and implement the survivor-centered approach, there are still numerous challenges requiring our decisive collective responses. And among them, it's expanding expertise and knowledge, inclusive survivor support, securing reparations, counteracting stigma, and amplifying voices. It is our joint obligation to ensure respect, support, and justice for all those who suffered from the heinous crimes of Russian occupiers. And I'm convinced that together we can create a world where survivors are heard, their rights are upheld, and peace prevails. Thank you.
Thank you, Miroslava. I will now give the floor to Lord Ahmad, as His Excellency needs to leave us in a few seconds, so we'll do a little detour and come back to Michelle just in a few seconds. Lord Ahmad, UK Special Representative on the Prevention of Sexual Violence in Conflict. You have the floor.
Thank you, and I hope it proves to be a useful detour. I'm grateful as I have to get to the Security Council for the next session. First of all, my immense gratitude to my dear friend, the Foreign Minister of Norway, to the DRC, Congo, Sierra Leone, and of course, the dear friend I've worked with over so many years on this Pramila pattern for bringing us together. Us coming here together today again underlines the joint commitment we have to address conflict-related sexual violence. At the UN Security Council in July, I called for stronger global action to bridge the gap between the framework set out in Security Council resolutions and the reality which is on the ground. This does require, bluntly put, ramping up efforts to put resolutions into practice, ensuring access to justice and providing survivors with critical services. The United Kingdom has led on an initiative which is termed Preventing Sexual Violence in Conflict. The key term there is the prevention, yet we're far from achieving that goal. To support these efforts, we've promoted the guidebook on state obligations for CRSV, produced by the Mukwege Foundation, which we supported directly with UK funding. This excellent resource helps states to implement their obligations and responsibilities, and it's a powerful advocacy tool for civil society and survivors. The simple message for all member states present here, if you haven't done so, embrace it. Beyond this, the UK has maintained momentum over the last decade, but certainly since the PSVI, Preventing Sexual Violence in Conflict conference last November in London, where we launched the International Alliance, which I can report today has grown to 23 members. The UK also continues to champion, working with Nadia Murad directly, the Murad Code, which many of us know. This really is the gold standard when it comes to documenting survivor testimonies. We must do this. We talk about putting survivors first. The UK has sought to do that since 2019, where our policies, our strategy, our programs are inspired and driven and produced with the direct intervention of two champions, survivors themselves of sexual violence. In terms of accountability, we are currently partnering with the ICC prosecutor, Karim Khan, to overcome barriers to justice. Why is it that someone who goes through the ordeals of crimes, the worst kinds of violations against their body, then have to endure a second reliving of that time and time again, exposing them to greater dangers? That's why I'm delighted we're making good progress on a new virtual reality court with the ICC to help survivors and potential witnesses understand what it would be like to testify. And this will be an added tool to provide support, putting survivors first. And on Tuesday this week, we appointed a UK military expert to support SRSG patterns work with armed forces around the world. That is also, in my mind, crucial. Let me assure everyone, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, survivors continue to be the heart of our efforts. Working with our survivor champions, we've also established now a survivor advisory group. My simple advice to other colleagues and member states from around the world is appoint survivor champions. It's inspiring in terms of what we can deliver. And finally, I encourage other states to consider how we can continue to collectively work together to ensure survivors are involved with the decision-making in everything we do. The violence we are talking about today, as we've heard just now from the prosecutor, is not inevitable. We can stop this. And that's where I end. That I'm proud to have led on this initiative over the last 7 years as the Prime Minister's special representative on preventing sexual violence in conflict. It should not be a label. It's down to all of us to make it a reality. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Lord Ahmad. I now turn to Michelle Jarvis, who's our last panelist for the day, who is a former international deputy to the prosecutor of the International Criminal Tribunal for former Yugoslavia, and presently the deputy head of the International Impartial and Independent Mechanism to assist investigation and prosecution of persons responsible for most serious crimes under international law committed by the Syrian Arab Republic. A very big job. And title. Michelle, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Chloe. Excellencies, good afternoon to everybody. I'm going to offer some observations this afternoon on holistic justice for sexual violence through the lens of my experience as a war crimes prosecutor over the past couple of decades, working first of all on cases concerning the Balkans and Rwanda, and now, of course, with the International Impartial and Independent Mechanism for Syria, or the IIIM, as we call it. In the 1990s, when media reports of sexual violence on a massive scale first surfaced in first the Balkan conflicts and then in the Rwandan genocide, there was strong condemnation and a statement of commitment to accountability by the international community. But the ad hoc courts and tribunals tasked with following through on this justice promise confronted a vast array of legal, conceptual, institutional and operational barriers that undermined their results, even if some important convictions were secured. The prosecution officers of both the Yugoslav and Rwandan tribunals carried out in-depth lessons learned exercises on their work on sexual violence, which have been published and are available to inform the work of other justice actors today. The good news is that we have made really significant progress on developing more mature legal frameworks for prosecuting sexual violence. But when it comes to the conceptual, institutional and operational barriers, we so often see the same mistakes being made in each new accountability effort. In 2018, as we went about setting up the IIIM, we had these lessons front of mind and we committed to addressing them in our work. Let me give a few brief examples. When it comes to the conceptual barriers, one of the powerful lessons we've been integrating from the ad hoc tribunals is the need to situate sexual violence in its proper context. It is, of course, important to pay dedicated, but at the same time, it's important to understand how the root causes link to broader structural gender discrimination. We're also guarding against separating out sexual violence from other harms that happen during the conflict. Otherwise, we risk mischaracterising the sexual violence and frustrating the victims and survivors who feel their experiences have been compartmentalised. When it comes to institutional barriers, past experience confirmed that we couldn't hope to produce effective outcomes in our cases if we did not first establish an institutional environment at the IIIM that was genuinely committed to promoting gender equality. So we're undertaking an experiment in gender-sensitive institution building at the IIIM. Past experience also confirmed that having a comprehensive gender strategy to guide the work of the office from an early stage would be essential. But a strategy alone would not be enough. We needed implementation tools to operationalise the strategy as a core part of our daily work. And so the IIIM Gender Strategy and Implementation Plan were born. These resources are also providing inspiration for other actors and can be adapted to other accountability contexts. When it comes to operational strategies, let me focus on one that relates very much to our novel justice facilitation role at the IIIM. Our job is to support the work of other justice actors, including those in national jurisdictions. As part of our gender strategy, we're taking steps to ensure that the work product we develop to share with those jurisdictions integrates a strong gender perspective. For example, the IIIM provided support to prosecutors for a case in Sweden by developing analysis about the situation of girls and women in ISIL-controlled areas in Syria, including in relation to forced marriage and gender segregation. More and more, we understand that we have to approach accountability for international crimes as an interconnected ecosystem made up of different actors playing coordinated roles. The IIIM's experience is creating precedents for how we can embed a strong gender analysis within an accountability ecosystem. Let me finish with 3 recommendations. First of all, we have to collectively commit to moving beyond rhetoric and to insist on implementation. We know so much more today about how to generate better results, but it takes a comprehensive approach and real commitment by justice actors to doing things differently. It's hard, and it can be tough for those inside institutions who are on the front line doing this work. We have to support them. Second, it would be great to see states who have war crimes units requesting their national criminal justice actors to also adopt gender strategies and implementation plans for their work, and to leverage assistance of actors like the IIIM to support. And finally, we need better ways to consolidate and disseminate our practical lessons learned regarding accountability for sexual violence and gender justice more broadly. Currently, our progress is fragmented, fleeting, and always at risk of regression. We need a comprehensive rethink about how we connect practitioners doing this work across different mandates and over time to increase the prospects of good outcomes for victims and survivors.
Thank you, Michelle. I will now directly turn to our 2 last speaker, and because we do not have a lot of time, I suggest you stay in your seat so we save the time. We will first hear from Her Excellency Anniken Huitfeldt, Minister of Foreign Affairs of Norway and a partner to the office. Excellency, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. I'm so grateful for this opportunity to be here with you all today. Justice for survivors of conflict-related sexual violence is a topic close to my heart. And allow me also to thank the Permanent Observer Mission of the African Union for hosting us here today. And special thanks to our co-organizers, friends. The reports of sexual violence taking place in Sudan, mainly by the Rapid Support Forces, are gruesome. In Sudan, sexual violence is used tactically and also strategically to spread fear and intimidation for political and military gain. We know that women and girls are being captive and raped. The ethnic dimension of this violence gives cause of great concern. Sexual violence is prohibited under international humanitarian law, which both Rapid Support Forces and Sudanese armed forces are obliged to comply with. Thank you so much, Mykoslava and Michelle, for sharing your very valuable experiences from other parts of the world, because this is a global problem. It affects people of all genders and all ages. Norway is deeply concerned by the increase in sexual-related violence against children. While the majority of survivors are women and girls, men, boys, and sexual minorities are also affected, particularly in situations of detention, but also in other contexts. States also need to provide services for survivors. Prevention and response to sexual and gender-based violence, including conflict-related sexual violence, is a key priority in Norway's humanitarian strategy. It's also an integral part of a national action plan on women, peace and security. So Norway worked hard to advance this agenda during our term in the UN Security Council. And we will continue to push this agenda in the years ahead. Many important messages have been delivered here today, but let me highlight 3 points that Norway sees as especially important. Prevention first is the best response, so therefore I welcome Pramila's initiative with ministers of defense in conflict zones, such as in South Sudan, to prevent these crimes from taking place. However, you cannot do this alone. I know that. We must all remind defense establishment and armed actors of their obligations not to commit sexual violence. Second, we must step up our efforts to fight impunity. We must do more to ensure that perpetrators are brought to justice. Survivors need rapid access to services in order to be able to report and bring a case through the justice system. We must do our utmost to support survivors in their fight for justice. Third, services must be aged and gender sensitive and include access to sexual and reproductive health services, psychosocial support and justice. Lastly, we must never overlook the agency of survivors. They must always be a part of the solution. Thank you so much for the cooperation.
Thank you, Excellency. I will now give the floor for closing remarks to the Executive Director of UNFPA, Natalia Kanem. You have the floor.
Thank you so much, Excellencies, distinguished guests, dear Special Representative Pramila Patten. A holistic journey for survivors implies justice and accountability, and this is what we've heard in the testimonies today. For UNFPA, the United Nations lead agency for addressing gender-based violence in humanitarian settings, we are deeply committed to a solutions-oriented approach, putting survivors of sexual violence at the center so that they do receive the holistic support that they need and deserve. So I join in thanking the governments of the Democratic Republic of Congo, of Norway, of Sierra Leone, and the Office of the Special Representative for convening us to use this as an important opportunity to look at how we as international government partners, civil society, can urgently and collectively do more. It is country leadership that faces a tremendous responsibility that we in the international community must support. How do we keep women and girls and everyone safe from harm? And how will we hold perpetrators who produce that harm to account? And how can we prioritize this in the context of the many ongoing crises that are fueled by conflict? Because as we meet, it is 84 million women and girls in the humanitarian hotspots around the world who are in need of such prevention and response services. In Congo, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, for example, we're working closely with government and with the First Lady's Foundation to be sure that we penetrate to address gender-based violence. We're also looking at every aspect of women and girls' experience, and as our colleague from MSF emphasized, shelter, water, sanitation, hygiene, food security, and camp management. It is a system, including a health system, that must work together to reduce the risk of sexual violence and to address it when prevention fails. Keeping women and girls safe, that is foremost, along with holding perpetrators accountable. Now, there's no path to healing and recovery that's identical, and everyone has their own particular experience. But for UNFPA, we know that listening to survivors is fundamental. The respect with which they must be treated is fundamental. And listening when they advocate for their own needs without judgment or stigma is part of this path to survivor-centered holistic care. In emergency settings, it is the health provider who is often the first and sometimes the only point of contact for survivors. So the training that they have, the knowledge and the skills to function and to provide clinical management of rape and to make referrals means that availability of services, again, must be prioritized so that women will be encouraged to report. So let us remember that the documentation of sexual violence is important, but we have to avoid putting them at risk of re-traumatization. And we certainly welcome the passage of new legislation in DRC and elsewhere on protection and reparations for victims of conflict-related sexual violence. So it is by listening to the needs of survivors that we will assure a holistic journey. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Natalia. And thank you, everyone, for being with us today. We do unfortunately have to wrap up, so there will be no time for a statement from the floor, but we will post the statement online for those who weren't able to make those statements. I now invite you to follow us next door for a little drink and some food. Thanks a lot, everyone, for this very rich panel.